Dr. James Walker wasn't just a scientist. He was an explorer of the unknown. While others focused on safe, predictable research, he thrived on pushing boundaries. His latest idea, however, was the most controversial yet: installing a camera inside a coffin to record what happened after burial. "This isn't about superstition or creating fear," Dr. Walker said passionately during a meeting with his skeptical colleagues. "This is about understanding the unseen processes of nature. Think of what this could mean for forensic science, environmental studies, or even archaeology. We have never directly observed what happens in such a confined environment." Despite his enthusiasm, the room fell silent. Many of his peers exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't every day that a respected scientist proposed such a bold and morbid experiment. "You're asking us to disturb the sanctity of burial," one colleague argued. "People won't accept this." But James was determined. "This isn't disrespectful," he countered. "This is science, and we will ensure it's done ethically, with full consent." Months of heated debates followed. Ethics boards rejected the project repeatedly. Religious groups protested the very idea, and even James's own team had doubts. Yet, he didn't give up. He refined his proposal, addressed every concern, and reached out to private donors willing to fund the project. Finally, approval came, with one strict condition: a willing volunteer. That's when Henry Roberts entered the story. A retired high school teacher and lifelong supporter of science, Henry was in the final stages of a terminal illness. When approached with the idea, he listened carefully before responding with a calm smile. "I've taught students about the wonders of science my entire life," Henry said. "If my body can help uncover something new, why not? I've lived a full life and I want to leave something meaningful behind." His words deeply moved Dr. Walker's team. Henry wasn't just a participant. He was a partner in their quest for discovery. The day of Henry's burial arrived. It was a bright, sunny morning with the scent of fresh flowers drifting in the air. His family gathered at the cemetery, their emotions a mix of sorrow and pride. They knew Henry's decision was unconventional, but they respected his choice. His daughter placed a single white rose on the coffin as it was lowered into the ground. Standing at a respectful distance, Dr. Walker and his team quietly observed. Their equipment had been carefully prepared, a small high-definition camera discreetly installed inside the coffin, along with sensors to monitor temperature, oxygen levels, and vibrations. Every precaution had been taken to ensure the setup was secure and non-intrusive. Back at the lab, the team gathered around a row of glowing monitors. The live feed from the camera displayed the interior of the coffin, soft white fabric lining the walls, perfectly still and serene. The sensors showed normal readings and the equipment hummed softly, ready to capture data. Dr. Walker looked at his team, his expression serious yet hopeful. "This is it," he said. "We're about to witness something no one has ever seen before. Let's document everything and stay focused." The experiment had officially begun. Back at the lab, the atmosphere was one of quiet anticipation. The team, led by Dr. James Walker, sat at their stations, their eyes fixed on the monitors displaying the live feed from inside the coffin. The camera's view showed the soft white fabric lining completely still, creating an eerie sense of calm. It was almost like looking into another world, one untouched by time. Lisa, a junior researcher, broke the silence. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Watching this, knowing what's inside." Dr. Walker glanced at her, his tone calm but firm. "It may feel unusual, but this is science. We're here to observe and learn." The first few hours passed without incident. The live feed showed no changes, and the sensors continued to record stable readings. Temperature, oxygen levels, and humidity, all normal. The lab's air conditioning hummed softly in the background, the only sound breaking the stillness. Daniel, the lead technician, monitored the data carefully. "Everything looks as expected so far," he said, logging the sensor readings into the system. "No signs of movement or activity." The team nodded, but the stillness wasn't entirely comforting. There was a strange tension in the air, as though they were waiting for something they couldn't quite define. The more they stared at the unchanging image on the screen, the heavier the silence felt. "Nature takes time," Dr. Walker reminded them. "We're unlikely to see anything significant for several hours, maybe even days. Patience is key." Despite his reassurances, the room remained tense. Each scientist was lost in their thoughts, wondering what they might witness over the coming hours. They were scientists, yes, but they were also human, and the idea of watching what happened in a confined coffin underground carried an unshakable unease. At the 6-hour mark, Daniel's brow furrowed. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he replayed a section of the feed. "Did anyone see that?" he asked softly. Lisa turned to him. "See what?" "There, at the edge of the screen," Daniel said, rewinding the footage frame by frame. The team crowded around his station, their curiosity reignited. At first, the footage looked exactly as it had for hours, still, peaceful, and undisturbed. But then they saw it, a faint flicker near the corner of the screen. "What was that?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Could it be interference?" Dr. Walker suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Daniel shook his head. "This equipment is state-of-the-art. It's designed to filter out interference. And besides, this doesn't look like a technical glitch." He zoomed in and slowed the footage further. The flicker was barely perceptible, but it was there, a brief, almost imperceptible movement at the edge of the screen. Dr. Walker straightened. "Log it," he instructed. "Note the time and details. It could be nothing, but it's worth documenting." The room fell silent once more as the team resumed their monitoring. The flicker, though brief, had left a lingering sense of unease. It was the first sign that something unexpected might be happening. Hours passed, and the live feed returned to its earlier stillness. But the tension in the lab had shifted. The team couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer simply observing nature. They were witnessing something they didn't yet understand. Dr. Walker sat at his desk reviewing the footage again and again. The flicker might have been minor, but it had stirred a sense of anticipation in him. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The experiment was still in its early stages, but deep down he felt it. This was only the beginning. The lab's tension had grown thicker with each passing hour. The flicker on the monitor earlier, though brief and subtle, had left an unsettling impression on the team. They resumed their work with heightened focus, meticulously observing the coffin's interior and monitoring the sensor data. By the 12th hour, the lab was completely silent save for the low hum of the equipment. Daniel, who had been closely watching the live feed, suddenly froze in his seat. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "Something's happening," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lisa, seated nearby, turned quickly. "What do you mean?" Daniel pointed at the monitor. "The shroud. Look at the shroud." The rest of the team gathered around, their eyes glued to the screen. At first it looked exactly as it had for hours, the soft, white burial shroud draped gently over Henry's body. But then, ever so slowly, they saw it. The edge of the shroud lifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably real. "Is that, movement?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Walker leaned closer, his face expressionless but his mind racing. "Rewind the footage," he instructed. "Play it back in slow motion." Daniel replayed the feed, frame by frame. The movement was undeniable. The shroud had shifted, lifting slightly on one side before settling back into place. "There's no airflow in the coffin," Daniel said, his tone sharp with confusion. "The coffin is sealed. Nothing should be able to move it." "Could it be vibrations from the soil settling?" Lisa suggested, though her voice wavered with doubt. Dr. Walker quickly shook his head. "The sensors show no seismic activity, no pressure changes. The soil around the coffin is completely stable." For a moment no one spoke. The team simply stared at the screen as if willing it to offer an explanation. But the burial shroud remained still, as if mocking their inability to understand what they had just witnessed. "Log it," Dr. Walker said firmly, breaking the silence. "We need to document every detail. Time, temperature, oxygen levels, everything." The team sprang into action, their earlier unease now replaced by an almost frantic determination. But even as they worked, their minds were filled with unanswered questions. Lisa glanced at Dr. Walker, her expression uncertain. Do you think it could be biological? Maybe something we don't know about the decomposition process? It's possible, Doctor. Walker replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. But we won't know until we analyze the data further. The room fell into a tense quiet once more as the scientists returned to their stations. They tried to focus on their work, but their eyes kept drifting back to the monitor as if expecting the shroud to move again. Hours passed and the live feed remained still. The earlier movement seemed almost like a dream, a fleeting moment of uncertainty that left more questions than answers. Yet deep down, every member of the team felt it. They were witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied their understanding of the natural world. Dr. Walker sat at his desk, replaying the footage for the 10th time. The shroud's movement had been subtle but deliberate, as though something unseen had brushed against it. He tapped his pen against his notebook, his mind racing with theories. We're just scratching the surface, he thought to himself. Something is happening in that coffin, and it's not random. But what? He glanced at the team, who were equally lost in thought. Whatever was happening, it was only the beginning, and they all knew it. As the 18th hour approached, the lab was silent, yet the tension in the air was palpable. The earlier movement of the shroud had shaken the team, but the stillness that followed only deepened their unease. Each scientist sat at their station, staring intently at the monitor as if willing something else to happen. Then a faint sound broke through the quiet. It was soft at first, so soft that Daniel, who had been monitoring the audio feed, thought it was a glitch. But as he turned up the volume, his expression changed. "Everyone listen," he said, his voice breaking the silence. The team gathered around as the sound grew clearer. It was rhythmic, deliberate. 3 soft taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. "What is that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Walker leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Amplify it," he instructed. Daniel adjusted the audio, and the tapping became louder. It was unmistakable now, a series of deliberate knocks, as though something inside the coffin was trying to communicate. Lisa's hands trembled as she clutched her notebook. Could it be the soil settling? Maybe vibrations from the environment? Daniel quickly shook his head. The sensors show no seismic activity, and even if the soil shifted, it wouldn't produce a pattern like this. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. "It's almost like a signal," Lisa said, her voice trembling. Dr. Walker took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Log the time and frequency of the sound. We need to rule out every possible explanation." The team worked quickly, their earlier curiosity now tinged with fear. The tapping continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. But the stillness didn't last long. A new sound emerged from the audio feed, faint, indistinct, but unmistakably human. "It's a voice," Daniel said, his eyes widening. The team froze, their hearts racing as they listened intently. The sound was soft and muffled, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Amplify it again," Dr. Walker ordered. Daniel adjusted the audio once more, and the voice grew clearer. The words were faint, but discernible. "Why am I here?" Lisa gasped, her face pale. That can't be possible," she stammered. Dr. Walker frowned, his mind racing. "Check the equipment," he said firmly. "Run diagnostics on the audio feed. This could be interference." Daniel quickly analyzed the data. "The equipment is functioning perfectly," he said. "There's no interference. The sound is coming from inside the coffin." The voice repeated the question. "Why am I here?" before fading into silence. The team sat in stunned disbelief, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Dr. Walker leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He was a man of science, driven by logic and evidence, but this defied everything he knew. "We need to stay focused," he said finally, his voice steady despite the unease in his chest. "Log everything, every sound, every reading. We need more data before we can make any conclusions." But even as he spoke, a thought lingered in his mind. One he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. What if they weren't just observing nature? What if something, or someone, was trying to reach out to them? By the 24th hour, the tension in the lab had reached its peak. The tapping sounds and faint voice had left the team shaken, but their scientific training kept them going. They logged every detail with precision, though an unspoken unease lingered in the room. The coffin feed on the monitor remained still, the burial shroud undisturbed, but no one could ignore the sense that something else was about to happen. Lisa broke the silence, her voice low. "Do you think we'll hear it again? The voice?" Dr. Walker didn't look up from his notes. "It's possible," he said. "But let's focus on what we can verify. Sounds, movements, data, those are our priorities." Daniel, who had been replaying the earlier footage, suddenly froze. His hand hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the monitor. "Dr. Walker, something's happening again." Everyone's heads snapped toward the screen. At first glance, the coffin interior looked the same as before, silent and still. But as they watched, the burial shroud began to shift. This time, the movement wasn't subtle. The fabric bunched slightly in the middle as though being pushed from beneath, then smoothed itself out again. The entire team leaned in closer, their breaths held as the shroud moved once more, this time dragging slightly to one side. "That's impossible," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "There's no airflow, no external force. How is it moving?" Dr. Walker's expression remained neutral, though his mind was racing. "Replay it," he said calmly. Daniel rewound the footage and played it back in slow motion. Frame by frame, the shroud's movement was clear and deliberate. There was no sign of what had caused it, no visible disturbance, no vibration, no external interference. "It's not natural," Daniel muttered. "It's like something's underneath it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unnerving. Dr. Walker straightened, his tone firm. "Log the time and details. Check the sensor data for any changes. Pressure, temperature, anything." The team worked quickly, their hands shaking slightly as they reviewed the data. But the readings showed nothing unusual. The coffin remained sealed, the environment unchanged. There was no scientific explanation for the movement they had just witnessed. Lisa glanced at Dr. Walker, her face pale. Could it be a biological reaction? Something we don't understand about decomposition? Dr. Walker hesitated before replying. "It's possible," he said carefully. "Gases released during decomposition could cause slight movements, but nothing like this. This is, deliberate." The lab fell silent again as the team returned their focus to the monitor. The shroud remained still, its earlier movements now a haunting memory. But the sense of unease in the room only grew stronger. It felt as though the stillness wasn't an end. It was a pause, a moment of calm before the next wave of the unknown. Dr. Walker sat back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He had entered this experiment with clear objectives to observe and document the natural processes of burial. But now, it felt as though they were on the verge of something far greater, something that defied logic and science. As the clock ticked on, the room remained tense, each member of the team silently bracing themselves for what might come next. Whatever was happening inside the coffin, it wasn't over. By the 36th hour, exhaustion had begun to creep into the lab, but none of the scientists dared to leave their stations. The earlier events, the tapping, the voice, and the shroud's movement, played on a loop in their minds, leaving them anxious and alert. Every monitor in the room seemed to hum with anticipation, as though something unseen was building toward a climax. Lisa sat with her notebook open, her pen idle. "Do you think we're recording something beyond science?" she asked quietly, almost as if afraid to voice her thoughts. Dr. Walker, standing by the main monitor, remained calm on the outside, though his thoughts mirrored Lisa's unease. "Let's not speculate," he replied, his tone measured. "Our job is to document what we observe. Whatever this is, we'll let the data speak for itself." But deep down, even Dr. Walker felt the weight of the unknown. This experiment was no longer just about science. It was about confronting something no one had ever expected to see. Suddenly, the live feed flickered. The screen flashed black for a moment, sending a jolt of alarm through the room. When the image returned, everything seemed normal at first until Daniel pointed at the monitor. "Look at the shroud," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. The shroud, which had been perfectly still since its last movement, now appeared bunched along one edge. But what caught their attention most wasn't the fabric. It was the wooden lid of the coffin above it. Slowly, faint letters began to form on the surface, as though etched by an invisible hand. "Is that writing?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The team leaned closer to the screen, their eyes wide with shock. The letters became clearer with each passing second, forming a single word, F-R-E-E. Dr. Walker's heart raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. "Zoom in," he ordered, his voice sharp but steady. Daniel enhanced the image, and the words stood out starkly against the dark wood. It wasn't carved or scratched. It looked as though it had been written in condensation or fine dust. The letters glowed faintly in the light from the camera, their presence both eerie and undeniable. "Log this immediately," Dr. Walker said, his tone firm. "Time, image clarity, everything." Lisa's hands trembled as she jotted down notes. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Why would it say that?" Dr. Walker didn't reply. He was too focused on the monitor, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. The word lingered on the coffin lid for several minutes before it began to fade, as though whatever had created it was retreating. The silence in the lab was broken only by the soft hum of the equipment. Every member of the team stared at the screen, waiting for something else to happen. But the coffin's interior remained still, its earlier activity now replaced by an eerie calm. And then, just as they thought the event had passed, the audio feed crackled to life. At first it was just static, faint and distorted. But slowly, the sound became clearer, resolving into a voice, a soft, deliberate whisper that filled the room. "Thank you," it said. The voice was calm, almost peaceful, but its presence sent chills through the team. It was unmistakably human, yet it defied all logic. The words echoed in the quiet lab, their simplicity carrying a weight that none of the scientists could fully comprehend. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the voice faded. The monitors flickered one final time before the feed went completely dark. Daniel scrambled to restore the connection, his hands flying across the keyboard. "The camera's offline," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's not responding." Dr. Walker stared at the blank screen, his expression unreadable. He knew the experiment was over, but the questions it had raised would haunt them for a long time. "Document everything," he said quietly. "Every sound, every image. We need to analyze this from every angle." But even as he spoke, he knew there were some mysteries that data couldn't explain. The word "free," the voice's final "thank you." These weren't just scientific anomalies. They were something deeper, something that transcended logic and reason. As the team sat in silence, Dr. Walker allowed himself a moment of reflection. Whatever they had witnessed, it wasn't just about decomposition or environmental processes. It was about life, death, and the thin, fragile line between the two. The lab was silent except for the faint hum of idle equipment. The blank monitors seemed to stare back at the team, as if mocking their efforts to explain what they had just witnessed. Exhaustion hung heavy in the room, but no one moved or spoke. Every scientist was lost in their thoughts, replaying the events of the past 36 hours. Dr. James Walker sat at the center of the room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. For the first time in his career, he felt truly at a loss. The experiment had been carefully planned, every variable accounted for, yet the outcome defied all logic. What had started as a purely scientific inquiry had spiraled into something much greater, something no amount of preparation could have anticipated. Lisa broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "Do you think we'll ever understand what happened?" Dr. Walker looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said. "But understanding isn't always immediate. Sometimes science takes years, or even lifetimes, to make sense of the unknown." Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The word "free," the voice, it felt deliberate, like something wanted us to see and hear it. Dr. Walker nodded slowly, It did feel intentional, he admitted. But whether it was a natural phenomenon or something else, we can't say. Not yet. Lisa glanced at her notes, the pages filled with hurried scribbles and data points. I keep thinking about the voice, she said. It didn't sound angry or upset. It sounded calm. Grateful, even. Grateful for what? Daniel asked, frowning. We didn't do anything, we just watched. Maybe that's what it wanted, Dr. Walker said quietly. Maybe it just wanted to be noticed, to be acknowledged. The team fell silent again, each grappling with the implications of his words. The experiment had been designed to study the decomposition process in a controlled environment, but it had uncovered something far more profound. Whether it was a quirk of biology, a rare environmental anomaly, or something beyond their understanding, one thing was certain. They had witnessed something extraordinary. Dr. Walker stood, his exhaustion evident, but his resolve unwavering. We've done our part, he said firmly. We've documented everything, and now it's time to analyze the data. Whatever the truth is, we'll find it. The team nodded, their initial fear replaced by a quiet determination. They began shutting down their stations, logging the final details of the experiment. The lab, once filled with an electric anticipation, now felt solemn, almost reverent. As Dr. Walker turned off the main monitor, he allowed himself one final thought. This experiment had started with a simple question: what happens inside a coffin after burial? But the answers they had found were anything but simple. They had ventured into the unknown, and though they didn't have all the answers, they had glimpsed something extraordinary. As the team packed up for the night, the voice's final words lingered in Dr. Walker's mind. Thank you. He didn't know what, or who, they had helped. But as he walked out of the lab and into the quiet night, he couldn't shake the feeling that their work had mattered. That in some way they had brought peace to something or someone left behind.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.